We are continuing our discussion about the progressives. And the last time we were talking virtually, we were discussing a terrible event that happened in New York City, the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. And the point I was trying to make, I'm trying to return to the point that the progressives often diagnosed symptoms and really tried to basically deal with the worst aspects of capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th century. They wanted to make society more efficient, and many of them were motivated really by compassion and decency, although sometimes their interpretation of that took them in strange places. They believed in the power of government, but sadly, you have workers still being seen as expendable. And by the way, I found it interesting in this discussion during the pandemic, there were people who were openly saying, well, to get the economy going again, maybe people should go back to work even though they were not at the apex of the pandemic, and they should go back to work, younger people, and we should just isolate grandpa. The important thing is to get the economy going, and if you do that too early, of course, lots of people get exposed. Those younger people take those viruses with them home. They could kill their grandparents, whatever. And then the other issue is, of course, young people get it too. An 18-year-old died from the pandemic in California. So this attitude on the part of the super rich that the poor are expendable, it has a long tradition in American history. We have that seen in the working conditions that those women had the Triangle Shirtwaist Company fire. People knew there were safety problems before that fire broke out. And that fuels the interest in radical politics. Now, I hesitate to call socialism radical because, in fact, it is the norm. There are aspects of socialism in almost every major wealthy power, industrial power in the world. In Europe, Japan, China has aspects, of course, of socialism in its economy. The United States does, Canada does, etc. So, but it's considered in that era part of the radical spectrum. As I noted, you have socialists winning elections during this time in reaction to the fact that companies get away with murder. But I want to be clear that not all radicals focused exclusively on conditions at the workplace. Radicals were really ready to consider all kinds of relationships, all kinds of structures in society. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a socialist, really wanted to examine white supremacy. Women were examining from the left the way in which capitalism promoted patriarchy, the power of men. And one example of that is a woman named Margaret Sanger. And we have a picture of her here, Margaret Sanger, who is going to not only look at the economic condition women face in society, the wages they get paid, but she's also going to look at their position in the family. And she's going to question some of the assumptions, like, for instance, the idea that men by nature are the heads of families. And she's going to want to allow women to gain control of something that they have not been able to control. And that is the reproductive cycle and the right to use their bodies as they choose. So Margaret Sanger is the daughter of a radical Irish father and a mother who died at age 50, giving birth to her 11th child. And that was not uncommon. And this is part of what's going to fuel it. We're going to talk about this in more detail in a second. Beginning of the 1800s, on average, the average woman had 7 live births in 1800. That actually drops, and this is an average, to 3.5 a century later. And there are all kinds of reasons for that. But women were used to bearing large families, and the poorer they were, very often the larger the families they were. So Sanger sees the tragic end of her mother's life, and she commits herself to something. She coins the term birth control. And she coins that term in 1915, and she launches a movement which has as its central cause providing reliable and accurate means or information on contraception and the means to do it. And doing this is going to make her, in many circles, a pariah. And it's interesting who ends up criticizing her. She believes that contraception is central to sexual and political reform and would alter the lives of women in fundamental ways, including economic. And she says at one point, I want you to listen to her words, because these are really bold. Again, we're used to, so far in this class, hearing radicals talk about wages, the length of the working week, etc. Now she's taking that radicalism into the home. She says this, quote, I believe that woman is enslaved by the world machine, by sex conventions. We'll explain that in a second. By motherhood and its present-day necessity, child rearing, by wage slavery, by middle-class morality, by customs, laws, and superstitions. So what is she talking about? Well, first of all, she's enslaved by the world machine. She's talking about capitalism. She's talking about the system of production which makes women servants of men who are ground up as workers in the industrial economy. She talks about sex conventions. What does that mean? I think you're familiar with this in your lives today. Men who are sexually active outside of marriage are treated one way. Women who are active sexually outside of marriage are treated in a very different way. Men often can achieve esteem through being sexually active. They're given complimentary names. They're seen as more virile by some people. Women are seen as tawdry and immoral and in some ways cheaper, even though men still desire sex with those women. The hypocrisy is deep. By motherhood, she's saying this. Women are expected to be the caregivers to the child. What does that mean practically? It means if they don't have reliable birth control and knowledge about it, that they'll get pregnant repeatedly, that their ability to do certain tasks will be compromised by pregnancy, that when the child is born, that mother will be expected to feed the child, breastfeeding, then later on be there to serve meals for the child, to chase after them, to clean diapers by hand, to keep the child active and off the streets, to provide a home. And by the way, during all this time, she's not earning a dime of income. You don't get paid to be a mother. And the father becomes the sole wage earner, if he's there, and that's not a guarantee. And he controls the family economy. Women have trouble building careers because of this. Then, and I would say to some extent now, women have trouble saving money. That means they have trouble becoming business owners, accumulating capital, and achieving positions where they are in charge of their economic destiny. And that's why she says, in its present necessity, child rearing. Wage slavery. Very many people on the left use this term, where your life is dependent on someone else. You don't sustain yourself. You're dependent on what your employer is willing to give you, and very often they give you very little. She talks about middle-class morality, customs, laws, and superstitions. I think this is really bold. She's talking about religion. She's talking about a Christian tradition in America where men read the Bible, they read the book of Genesis, and in their interpretation, the person who's responsible for bringing sin into the world is Eve. Eve is responsible in the Garden of Eden. She gets tempted by the snake. And one of the consequences in the book of Genesis, according to this sin of disobedience, eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is this. Childbirth will be painful. a fact of women's lives reproductively is seen as evidence by men, and the men who wrote that book, as evidence of their sinfulness. Even though men want babies, they want heirs. Secondly, the other consequence is death. The implication is in the book of Genesis that we were immortal, free of disease. Eve succumbed to sin at the hands of the serpent. She tempted Adam, made him a sinner. Both were punished as a result of that. We've had death, disease, pain, suffering because of that. And that punishment is even imprinted in how women reproduce. And throughout the Bible, you have men as prominent figures, a number of women who are prominent or even named in the Bible as few. That's the religious atmosphere in America in that era that women have to deal with. It's a religious tradition that demeans the role of women and holds them as frail and defective. And actually, it's interesting, for much of the history of American literature, 1700s or 1800s, it was common to depict women as more prone to sin and to moral defect, and men being stronger. And then when that script flipped, men were often portrayed as the people who dealt with the sinful, terrible world. They went out, they made business deals, they got their hands grubby, accumulating money. But women were spiritual. Suddenly the script flipped. They're spiritual. They are the teachers of our children. We can't possibly let them get involved in business and politics because it'll corrupt them. So either way the script is interpreted, women are supposed to be subservient to men in politics and in the economy. Sanger directly challenges that. Now, she knew that large families tended to be poorer families, and that the more women, or the more children a woman bore, particularly later in life, the more disabled children they were likely to bring into the world. And she knows also that she's living in a world where the government provides no public services at all for women with disabled children. And this could increase the economic hardship that a family endures. And I say this to explain something that is unfortunate about Margaret Sanger. And she's heroic for her efforts to get contraceptive knowledge and the means of contraception to women, because that was the way women commonly died, was giving birth. She saved lives, and the organization she founds, Planned Parenthood, which will provide for many women their only access to medical examinations, gynecological examinations, pelvic examinations, etc. Cancers are detected, all kinds of things that save women's lives. She saved, through her campaign in the early 20th century, countless lives, but she was also shaped by the attitudes of her time, and that includes racism and support of eugenics. So she realized that, again, there's a connection between high rates of reproduction and numbers of disabled children. And so she wants to prevent that, and that she sees that as a goal of her campaign. She says this, quote, "More children from the fit, less from the unfit, that is the chief issue of birth control." And in the 1920s, and again, I want to point out, if you're looking for people who are heroes by our standards today, you're going to be disappointed. Even the best people at that time sometimes embrace horrible ideas, and I think that's true in our age. Who knows what people 100 years from now will be embarrassed about us. I can come up with a list, but we don't know definitively. But she partners with a doctor Clarence J. Gamble, a medical doctor. And they launch in the 1930s what comes to be known as the Negro Project, where they encourage African Americans to practice birth control and they tried to persuade them even to end giving birth by voluntarily submitting to sterilization. That's obviously, I think, for Sanger and Gamble, there's obviously a concern about black people specifically supposedly being unfit. I will make this a little more complicated, though, to note that, in fact, W.B. Du Bois, an African-American leader who certainly wanted the liberation of his people, believed that large families were holding African-Americans back economically. And he wanted to reduce the size of the African-American family, and he did believe that some African-Americans were unfit. Again, the idea of eugenics is so widely accepted, people on the political right, people on the political left, that you find just wide agreement on people who are generally better off and better educated. So they have this campaign. So in any case, in trying to bring about this awareness of contraception and particularly effective means of contraception, she runs directly headlong into the laws of the time. Laws lobbied for in the 1800s, late 1800s, by Anthony Comstock. Comstock got what came to be known as Comstock laws passed by the U.S. Congress in 1873. Comstock was an anti-pornography crusader. And he thought one of the biggest health crises of the era, something that damaged bodies and damaged minds, was, and I apologize for bringing it up, masturbation. He believed that damaged the nervous system, that it made men weak, prone to disease and prone to ill behavior like crime, etc., that it caused degeneracy, that people who engaged in that were prone to be alcoholic, etc. And so he saw pornography as basically something that encouraged that behavior. And so the laws that were passed by Congress, the Comstock laws, made it a crime to mail pornographic material, but here's where it's relevant to our topic. Included in the definition of pornography was any information on contraception or abortion. So sexually explicit material, sex toys, information on birth control, information on abortion, all were thrown into the same category. He's appointed a special agent for the U.S. Postal Service and will become famous. And he's authorized to open mail that he suspects contains this material. And by the way, it becomes a federal offense. He's authorized to arrest people, and his agents to arrest people if you're saying this is a method, this is a shield method of birth control. This is, here's how the rhythm method will work, or whatever methods here's what a condom is. Any of these things would be deemed pornographic, and he could arrest them. And by the way, he would hold these big rallies where there were bonfires of these materials, both the actual materials and the literature describing them. Well, why was there such a concern about abortion and contraception? We talked earlier about how doctors used the fact that midwives, who were widely accepted in society, sometimes used small amounts of poison to help women terminate pregnancies, and sometimes those small amounts of poisons ended up killing the woman. And so that became a big thing, and we mentioned that early in the 1800s. Abortion was so widely accepted that there were ads for abortionists in papers like the New York Times, but doctors forming the American Medical Association wanted to drive women out of the medical care business. And so they used the fact that there were a small number of women who died in the care of midwives to basically drive them out of business and outlaw abortion. They were worried about the health of the woman, not about the status of the fetus, which is different than the abortion politics today. Why are they worried about the issue again? by the time of Margaret Sanger, it's who's practicing contraception and who's practicing abortion. So here's an interesting paradox. Sanger's a eugenicist. Other eugenicists hate her. Why? Here's why. I mentioned before, the birth rate, when I said 7, I was talking about I wasn't talking about poor women. I was talking about middle class and affluent women. 7 children per family in 1800, 3.6 by 1900. And again, that's not literal. There wasn't 6/10 of a child born. This is average, right? The highest percentage of practitioners in terms of women who go to get information about contraception, who get abortions, are better off women, better educated women, and these women are white. Their birth rate is dropping at a time, like we've said, when immigrants are coming into the country from Eastern and Southern Europe in particular. That's the biggest group. A lot of Jews and a lot of Catholics particularly, and Catholics since the 1200s had rules against contraception. By doctrine, the only purpose of sex that's sanctioned in the Bible is for the purpose of creating a family. Any sexual act that doesn't lead to that, according to Catholic Church doctrine, is sinful. It's grounded in lust. Well, these Catholics are having large families, Jews are having large families, Poles are having large families, Russians are having large families, and that panics people of Western, Northern European descent, people who then at that point are defined as unmistakably white, and they're worried that they're being swamped by racial inferiors. And that includes men like Theodore Roosevelt, who actually at one point warns this, that the declining birth rate of well-educated white women compared to people of color, black women, and all these Eastern Southern European immigrants is leading to what he calls race suicide. In other words, we will cease as the United States to be a white country if we don't stop those particular women from having or practicing contraception or having abortions. We have to stop it. So this becomes a big cause. Sanger's pushing against that. In 1914, she defies the Comstock laws. She publishes a newspaper called The Woman Rebel. And that paper very explicitly promotes birth control and provides information to its readers explicitly on how to effectively practice birth control. By the way, the birth control pill, is not going to be available till the 1960s. There are methods, barrier methods, the condoms, etc., they're available. The pill is not available yet. And that'll be a real revolution, by the way. Well, we'll talk about that in a second. So the U.S. Postal Service declares Sanger's publication obscene. And they bring charges against her. So she's facing the possibility of time in federal prison. And she flees to Europe. And by the way, her timing is interesting because it's during World War I. And here's how big a case it is. And I think this explains how Woodrow Wilson, who's the president at that time, explains his actions. She becomes an international celebrity. And in Europe and much of the rest of the world, she's seen as a martyr of free speech. She's publishing a newspaper telling women how to take care of their bodies. And she faces time in prison. And so there are international movements amidst World War I calling for the charges to be dropped. Woodrow Wilson doesn't want the image of the United States damaged because in 1916, he's already conscious that he is likely to lead the United States into World War I. He's campaigning on a slogan, or his supporters are campaigning on a slogan of, he kept us out of war. Wilson already knows that's going to be inevitable. And he's going to argue that the United States is the morally superior side to Germany, because it is a democracy. And in fact, famously, he'll say, this war will make the world safe for democracy. That includes free speech. By the way, Wilson's a hypocrite because no president in the 20th century did more to suppress free speech than Wilson did during World War I. But nevertheless, there's pressure, and under those pressures, the federal charges against Sanger is dropped when she returns home. And she goes on to found Planned Parenthood. That becomes a very controversial group. And by the way, the Supreme Court doesn't rule that there is a constitutional right to privacy regarding matters like birth control until the 1960s. There's a case called, Supreme Court case in the 1960s, Griswold versus Connecticut. Griswold versus Connecticut, where the court says that in the penumbra and the umbrella of rights given Americans, the right against unreasonable searches and seizures, the right to be shielded from unreasonable arrest, etc. There's implied, even though it's not specifically said, a right to privacy. And that extends to the privacy of what a woman discusses with her doctor and what she chooses to do based on that advice and what she does to act on that advice. The states across the country had outlawed contraceptive devices, including a new device called the pill. As a result of that Griswold decision in 1966, those laws are overturned. And by the way, that paves a path to a later, more famous decision, 1973, Roe v. Wade, which says, and it's still never been overturned, that a woman has the right, based on her right of privacy and a right to equal treatment under the laws. She has a right to an abortion in the first trimester without conditions. She has a right to an abortion, although states can regulate in the second trimester, and then states are allowed to ban abortions in the final trimester. And that is still the law of the land. Although because of, and we have to be honest, because of terrorism, including the assassination of doctors providing these services, the bombings of clinics, and by the way, the first protest at any abortion clinic in the U.S. happened in Dallas, Texas. Because of that, many states basically have outlawed abortion without actually doing it, because they have set up rules that make it impossible for doctors to practice, or doctors are so intimidated they're not willing to. In fact, a lot of medical schools won't train doctors how to do the procedure. But anyway, so Margaret Sanger is an extremely controversial figure. I'll note that many people who don't like women's right to choose will focus on the eugenics part of her career and ignore the untold number of lives she saved, women's lives she saved through her effort in her battle for the idea that women have a right, sovereignty over their own bodies. Now, there are other radicals in this period. The socialists who are in the, are more radical than the socialists. There are people who are more radical than the socialists. One example is the Industrial Workers of the World, formed in 1905, led by William Dudley Big Bill Haywood. They come to be known as Wobblies. I actually had an uncle who was a Wobbly. They called for one big union to represent all the working class. They wanted to they wanted revolution. They wanted an end to capitalism. They took extreme measures not endorsed by the socialists and not earlier by the populists, such as sabotaging industrial equipment and general strikes where they aim to freeze the entire economy of a particular place. Now, no left-wingers were more feared by the power structure in this era than anarchists. We mentioned anarchists before. Anarchists are people who believe that any level of government, if it has formal structures, is going to tend to be in the hands of the wealthy and the powerful and become a tool of oppression of the working class in particular. And they are seen, I may have said this before, in the same light that later generations would see Al-Qaeda. And newspapers are filled with this. We talked about this as we were discussing the Haymarket Square bombing that anarchists got accused of planting. Anarchists assassinated Tsar Alexander II in Russia in 1881. They were blamed for Haymarket Square, as I said, in 1886. They pull off a series of terrorist attacks in the 1890s, including the bombing of a police station in Paris and a classical music performance, because classical music drew the wealthy and the powerful. It was not a venue for the common person. And this is in 1894, when the bomber, a man named Emile Henry, was executed, sent to the guillotine. By the way, they guillotined people in France until the 1960s, in case you, or actually the 1970s. 1977, the last person to be guillotined. It was the same year the movie Star Wars came out, believe it or not. When he's guillotined, a series of retaliatory bombs are set off across Europe and across France. Now, I forgot to, give me a second. We're going to have anarchism make an impact in the United States in a very controversial way. So let me get, I need to pull up a picture of this man. I forgot to do it. Here we go. Give me a second. Man named Leon Czolgosz. And he is going to be the child of immigrants. Let's look at him here. Hold on. A man very bitter about the condition of the working class. And he's going to make history in a tragic way, September 6, 1901. We had talked about, and let me spell his name, by the way. He's an Eastern European, or, he's born in the U.S., but his parents were Eastern European immigrants. And please remember how Eastern European immigrants were seen by people of Western European descent. Czolgosz is how you pronounce his name. He is someone who is convinced that the working class is not going to be able to find any liberation under capitalism, that they will always be oppressed. And he sees the President of the United States, a man we've already talked about, named William McKinley. We talked about him when we talked about the election of 1896, the election where his opponent, William Jennings Bryan, ran as both a populist and a Democrat. He gets reelected to the White House in 1900. He's early in his term. Presidents were sworn into office then in March, so he's 6 months into his second term. He sees, Czolgosz sees William McKinley as a tool of bankers, Wall Street investors, railroad companies, and Czolgosz sees all those interests as being deadly enemies of the working class. And he knows children are dying in coal mines. Workers are being shot by Pinkerton guards when they go on strike. And he's going to try to make a very dramatic statement. McKinley is going to, on September 6, 1901, travel to Buffalo, New York. There is basically a giant fair, kind of like a state fair, only it extends for the whole Western Hemisphere, the Pan American Exhibition. And they set up a tent, and they say, let's have the president greet voters. And so there's a receiving line, and McKinley is going to shake hands with everybody who comes up to say hi to him. And this is a big deal. They don't have television, they don't have movies. Seeing a president in person is a gigantic deal. And so Czolgosz gets in the line, and he wraps a pistol in a handkerchief. When McKinley reaches over to shake his hands, Czolgosz pulls out the gun, fires the bullets into his belly, and McKinley is going to live for 8 more days, eventually die, and history has changed. Czolgosz will be executed for his crime. Now, McKinley's mentor, his fundraiser, his guru, a man who was very much a voice of the rich and powerful in America, Mark Hanna, when he hears that McKinley has died, he has this reaction. He says, "Oh my God, now that damn cowboy is president." Who is he referring to? He's referring to this man, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt will be the first progressive in the White House. He is a true believer in the progressive cause, and he will revolutionize the presidency. He will revolutionize the powers of the office, and he'll be nothing will ever be the same in terms of the relationship of the government to the average voter after that. So we have to explain the comment that Hannah made. At one point in the 1880s, Roosevelt actually goes and becomes a cowboy after one terrible day when his first wife and his mother die within 11 hours. He has a daughter. He hands the daughter off to a woman relative, take care of her, and he goes off and he's a cowboy out west. And he forms close friendships. And by the way, those cowboys will eventually serve with him in the Spanish-American War. We'll talk about that in a second. So, who is this damn cowboy? Well, he is a descendant of a family of Dutch origin, the Roosevelts, that achieved fame, wealth, and status in New York State back in the 1600s. And as a group, the Roosevelts tend to believe that those who receive much should give a lot back in return. It's what's called noblesse oblige, the obligations of the noble. So he grows up in an atmosphere of privilege, but he does have one experience that I think makes him different than others who grow up in privilege, like Rockefeller, for instance. He has health struggles. He's asthmatic. He's extremely nearsighted. You see the glasses there. He often is weak in his childhood. And so he puts himself on a very rigorous self-improvement program because he's determined and he's obsessed with manhood and with his personal manliness. He's going to overcome these health struggles. So he, during his youth and throughout his life, will lift weights, swim across lakes and rivers. He boxes, he hunts, he climbs mountains. A couple of times he almost dies when he's quote-unquote exploring. He's going to remote parts of the world, and he almost dies twice. And by the way, he also takes that attitude intellectually. Both Roosevelts who become presidents are cousins. Theodore Roosevelt's a Republican, Franklin's a Democrat. Theodore's a progressive. Franklin Roosevelt is seen as the founder of modern-day liberalism. Though related ideologies, but not exactly the same. Both of them are gifted intellectually. Not geniuses, but very smart. And smart enough to surround themselves by people who are smarter than they are. And Teddy Roosevelt is an absolute avid reader and a speed reader. He is typically, on a typical morning, he will read an entire book before breakfast and absorb it. He often reads as many as 3 or 4 a day, which makes me think I should change the reading list for this class. But anyway, he's also a prolific writer. His first book written by him is published when he's 22. He will author 2,000 articles and essays and books before he dies. And it's a rock and roll slogan. He lives fast, he dies young at age 60. Both Roosevelts have that trajectory. Both of them end up dying earlier than many men of wealth in that era. And they pack a lot in those years. His rise in politics is spectacularly fast. So he's a Harvard graduate. He is serving as William McKinley's Assistant Secretary of the Navy when the Spanish-American War breaks out. Let me briefly explain that war. That's declared on April 21st, 1898. Essentially, the European powers, and we'll talk about this in more detail later, like England, France, and so on, have built empires across the world. They have fueling stations for their ships. They have access to raw materials like oil, gold, tin, building materials, etc., diamonds, through their control of other people's lands. And there's a fear in America that America's behind the curve. It spent so much time subduing Native Americans in North America and establishing the borders of the United States that this global empires are being established by these other powers. If the U.S. doesn't build its own empire and a navy that it can fuel all around the world, the U.S. will be second or third rate or even worse. And so Americans need to build an empire. The Spanish Empire is crumbling. There's a rebellion simultaneously in Cuba and Philippines. Those are two of the last major possessions by the Spanish Empire at that point, when they had once controlled almost all of North and South America. And so the United States is aware of these revolutions going on. And Cuba in particular is 90 miles away from the United States. And so the press at that time, people like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, for whom the Pulitzer Prize is named, really think a war would be a cool thing to cover. A lot of people buy newspapers if you cover a war. They promote the idea of a war. And again, I'll talk about this in more detail later, but the United States is pushed by the press. McKinley is pushed by the press into sending a ship to Havana Harbor to make a statement, because there are all these reports that Spanish are committing human rights abuses in Cuba. And the Americans are pretending to be outraged by that. And so they send a ship there. The ship eventually blows up, probably because of a boiler room accident. But the press promotes the story that it's because the Spanish attacked the ship, which is ludicrous because the Spanish already had two revolutions, two different parts of the world, and they knew they were outmatched in terms of wealth, weapons, etc. by the United States. Nevertheless, the war starts. Teddy Roosevelt has a personal stake here. He loved his father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., but one thing about his life embarrassed him. Teddy Roosevelt's father was one of many rich men in the Civil War who paid a substitute to serve in his place. And Teddy Roosevelt, the president, the future president, was embarrassed by that, thought that was a stain on Roosevelt manhood. He's eager for battlefield glory. And in fact, at one point in his career, he'll say, war every now and then is good for a nation. He's a little crazy. So he resigns his position in the administration, and with some of those cowboy friends from the Dakotas from the 1880s, he forms the first United States Volunteer Cavalry, a regiment that comes to be known as the Rough Riders. Now, I want to be clear. The United States Navy plays absolutely the most important role in defeating the Spanish. That part of the conflict against Spain lasts 4 months, and the Navy is the reason we won the war. Nevertheless, Roosevelt does something that's very important to modern politics. He brings reporters with him. He cultivates contacts with them. Reporters find him to be a good interview, a charismatic personality. And so if something happens when a reporter there, it immediately becomes much more earth-shaking. So there's a battle at a place called Kettle Hill. The press reports it as San Juan Hill. He wins this battle. And by the way, again, he's a bit crazy. He wants to be a hero. And so he, during this battle, puts his soldiers, and by the way, there are a lot of black soldiers in the Rough Riders. You wouldn't know that from the way that the events are often depicted. But his soldiers and himself at unnecessary danger in the battle. He almost gets a large number of them killed because of his recklessness. Nevertheless, he wins this battle July 1st, 1898. It's seen immediately as one of the key moments in the war. And boy, he was famous before. Now he's really famous and he's a hero. So what happens? So this is 1898. He's in his 30s. He's a national hero. There's a governor's race in New York that year. And the New York Republicans say, hey, war hero, let's nominate him. Sure bet, right? And so they nominate him for governor. So he goes from being Assistant Secretary of the Navy to being a war hero to getting elected governor all in the same year. And he goes to Albany, and guess what he does? He's a progressive. He pushes for regulations of big business, higher taxes on big business, to fund government programs, regulation of the railroads. He's popular amongst average New Yorkers. And the big politicians in the Republican Party, guess what? They're friends of Wall Street. They don't like any of this stuff. And they say, oh my God, we've created a monster. What are we going to do about Teddy Roosevelt? What happens if he becomes president? He's governor of the most populous state in the Union. That's stick him somewhere where no one will ever hear from him again. That's give him an office so meaningless, so powerless, that they'll put a silver alert out for him. They'll put his picture on a milk carton. Have you seen this man? He'll vanish completely. So guess what? They nominate him for vice president. Because typically all vice presidents do is go to funerals. They can cast the deciding vote if there's a tie vote in the Senate. But by and large, I think the power of the vice presidency was summarized by John Nance Garner, who was Franklin Roosevelt's first vice president for 8 years. And he said, and pardon the language, he said once famously that the vice presidency wasn't worth a bucket of warm piss. If you're ambitious, if you want power, if you want to make a difference, don't be vice president. Well, guess what? He's vice president in 1901 in September when Leon Czolgosz changes history. Leon Czolgosz makes Teddy Roosevelt president of the United States. And he is going to be a force in nature. Now, let's be clear. Very often, people make mistakes. So if I asked you who the youngest president ever in United States history was, I think I know what you say, because over the years, I've been teaching this since 2001, students almost always say John F. Kennedy was the youngest president ever. John Kennedy was 43 when he became president. He dies at age 46. Roosevelt's 42. By the way, personal story, I was traumatized emotionally when Barack Obama became president. Not because he was president, because he was 48. I realized I was older than the president, and that's sort of how life, you're aging when you're older than presidents, and then first you're older than athletes and actors and actresses, then you're older than presidents. Then when you get older than some Supreme Court justices like I am now, it's time to plan your estate. But anyway, Roosevelt at 43 is going to be a force of nature. No one's ever seen a president like this before. We'll talk about his presidency next time.